My name is Alex, and I've always been drawn to the wild. Not the kind of wild you find in a crowded bar on a Friday night, but the real, untamed wilderness, the kind that humbles you, makes you feel both insignificant and utterly alive. That's why, when my buddy Mark suggested a hiking trip to Canada Pass, nestled high in the Rocky Mountains, I didn't hesitate for a second. Mark and I go way back, to the days of scraped knees and treehouse forts. We've shared countless adventures, from ill-advised camping trips in our parents' backyards to navigating the chaotic streets of European cities on a shoestring budget. He knows I'm always up for a challenge, especially one that involves breathtaking scenery and a good dose of solitude. The idea of Canada Pass had been floating around in Mark's head for a while. He'd stumbled upon it in some obscure hiking forum, raving about its pristine alpine lakes, the panoramic views that stretched for miles, and the almost eerie silence that enveloped the area. He'd even mentioned something about it being a less traveled route, which for an introverted soul like me was a major selling point. Think about it, Alex. He'd said over the phone, his voice buzzing with excitement. No crowds, just us in the mountains. We can camp by one of the lakes, maybe even spot some wildlife. It'll be epic. Epic was exactly what I needed. Life had been, well, life. The daily grind of my software development job was starting to feel like an endless loop, and the constant hum of the city was beginning to grate on my nerves. I craved the quiet, the clean air, the feeling of my muscles working against the incline of a mountain trail. So, I agreed. We spent the next few weeks planning the trip, poring over maps, and gathering our gear. Mark, ever the meticulous planner, handled the logistics permits, campsite reservations. As it turned out, even less travel trails sometimes required them, and enough dehydrated food to last us a week. My contribution was mostly in the equipment department. I've always been a bit of a gearhead, so I made sure we had the best tent, sleeping bags, and hiking boots money could buy. I even splurged on a new, high-powered headlamp, figuring it couldn't hurt to be prepared for any late night bathroom breaks in the wilderness. The drive to the trailhead was long but scenic. We left early on a crisp Saturday morning, the rising sun painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. As we drove further west, the landscape gradually transformed from rolling plains to rugged, snow-capped peaks. The air grew colder and crisper, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Mark, who was behind the wheel, had put together a playlist of classic rock anthems, and we sang along at the top of our lungs, our excitement building with every mile. We stopped for lunch at a small diner in a mountain town, fueling up on greasy burgers and strong coffee. The locals, weathered and friendly, eyed our hiking gear with knowing smiles, offering us snippets of advice about the trails and the weather conditions. By late afternoon, we finally reached the trailhead. It was marked by a simple wooden sign, slightly weathered and partially obscured by overgrown bushes. Canada Pass Trail. It read, with an arrow pointing towards a narrow path that disappeared into the dense forest. A wave of anticipation washed over me as I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff limbs. The air here was noticeably cooler, and the silence was almost deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze and the distant chirping of birds. It was exactly the escape I had been craving. We hoisted our backpacks onto our shoulders, the weight of familiar and comforting pressure. Mark double-checked the map one last time, a serious expression on his face. "Our Alex," he said, adjusting his own pack. "Ready for an adventure?" "Born ready," I replied, a grin spreading across my face. The initial part of the trail was relatively easy, winding through a thick pine forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in dappled patterns, illuminating patches of moss and wildflowers. The ground was soft under our boots, covered in a layer of fallen needles and leaves. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. We hiked in comfortable silence for a while, each of us lost in our own thoughts, soaking in the tranquility of our surroundings. After about an hour, the trail began to ascend more steeply, and we started to feel the burn in our legs. We paused for a water break, leaning against a couple of sturdy trees, catching our breath. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Mark said, gazing up at the towering trees. "Absolutely," I agreed, taking a long swig from my water bottle. Just what the doctor ordered. As we continued our ascent, the forest gradually began to thin out, giving way to more open meadows dotted with wildflowers in vibrant hues of purple, yellow, and red. The views started to become more expansive, offering glimpses of the distant mountain peaks. We passed a few other hikers along the way, exchanging brief nods and smiles. Most of them seemed to be day trippers, their packs smaller and lighter than ours. We were clearly in it for the long haul. As the afternoon wore on, the sky began to take on a golden hue, and the shadows grew longer. We reached a small stream, its water crystal clear and ice cold. We refilled our water bottles and splashed some of the refreshing liquid on our faces. "We should probably start looking for a campsite soon," Mark said, consulting the map. "There's supposed to be a designated area near the lower lake, about a mile or so from here." We continued hiking, the anticipation of reaching our campsite spurring us on. The trail began to climb again, this time more steeply and over more rugged terrain. We navigated over loose rocks and fallen logs, our boots crunching on the gravel. Just as we were starting to feel the fatigue set in, we rounded a bend in the trail and caught our first glimpse of the lower lake. It was even more stunning than the pictures Mark had shown me. The water was a deep, sapphire blue, reflecting the surrounding peaks like a mirror. The air was still and quiet, and the only sound was the gentle lapping of the water against the shore. We found the designated campsite area nestled among a cluster of pine trees, slightly away from the lake. There were a few other tents already set up, but the sites were spaced far enough apart to offer a sense of privacy. We chose a spot with a good view of the lake and began to unpack our gear. Setting up camp was a well-rehearsed routine for us. We worked efficiently, each of us knowing our role. Within an hour, our tent was pitched, our sleeping bags were laid out, and our cooking stove was ready to go. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, we sat by the lake, eating our dehydrated meals and sipping hot tea. The stars began to appear, one by one, until the night sky was a breathtaking tapestry of twinkling lights. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. It was in that moment, sitting there under the vast expanse of the starry sky, that I felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over me. This was it. This was the escape I had been longing for. The beauty of the wilderness, the camaraderie of a good friend, the simple satisfaction of a day well spent. We talked for a while, sharing stories and jokes, our voices hushed in the stillness of the night. Eventually, the fatigue of the long day caught up with us, and we decided to turn in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, feeling warm and cozy. The sounds of the forest, the gentle breeze rustling through the trees, the distant murmur of the stream lulled me into a state of deep relaxation. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard something that made me jolt awake. It was a sound I couldn't quite place, a sort of low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods. It was followed by a series of rustling noises, as if something large was moving through the underbrush. My heart started to pound in my chest. I held my breath, straining my ears to listen. The sounds faded away after a few moments, and the forest fell silent once again. I told myself it was probably just a bear or a coyote, common inhabitants of these mountains. But there was something about the sound, something unsettling, that lingered in my mind. It didn't sound quite like any animal I had ever heard before. I lay there for a long time, my senses on high alert, listening for any further sounds. But the forest remained quiet, and eventually exhaustion overtook my fear, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling refreshed, the unease of the previous night having faded with the sunrise. The lake was even more beautiful in the morning light, its surface shimmering like 1,000 diamonds. After a quick breakfast, we packed up our campsite and prepared to continue our hike towards Canada Pass. According to the map, it was still a good distance away, and the trail was supposed to get more challenging as we gained altitude. As we were getting ready to leave, I noticed something odd near the edge of our campsite. It was a small, hand-carved wooden sign stuck into the ground next to a large pine tree. It hadn't been there the night before. Curiosity piqued, I walked over to take a closer look. The sign was roughly hewn, and the words were carved into the wood in a simple, almost childlike script. There were 4 lines of text, and as I read them, a chill ran down my spine. The sign read, "Welcome to Canada Pass. Please respect the following rules. 1. Never stray from the marked trail. 2. Do not make loud noises after nightfall. 3. If you see a light that is not yours, do not approach it. 4. If you hear singing, run in the opposite direction." Mark walked over, noticing my stunned expression. "What is it?" he asked, peering over my shoulder at the sign. We both stared at the strange message, a sense of unease settling over us. Rules. What kind of rules were these? This wasn't a national park with official regulations. This was supposed to be a remote, less traveled trail. "That's weird," Mark said, scratching his head. Maybe some local put it up as a joke. I wasn't so sure. There was something about the tone of the sign, the stark simplicity of the warnings, that felt unsettlingly serious. "I don't know, Mark," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It feels off." He shrugged. "Probably nothing. Let's just stick to the trail and not make too much noise just in case. And definitely don't go chasing any strange lights or singers." He gave a nervous chuckle. Despite his attempt at levity, I could tell that Mark was just as unnerved as I was. We exchanged a worried glance, and then, With a shared sense of apprehension, we turned and started walking down the trail, leaving the strange sign behind. But the image of those 4 rules, stark and ominous, remained etched in my mind, casting a shadow over the beauty of the morning and the adventure that lay ahead. Something told me that our hike to Canada Pass was about to become a lot more complicated than we had ever imagined. The trail leading away from the lower lake was noticeably different from the one we had followed the previous day. It was narrower, steeper, and much more rugged. The well-worn path had given way to a more primitive track, marked only by occasional cairns of stacked stones. The forest here was denser, the trees taller and more imposing, their branches intertwined overhead, creating a thick canopy that filtered out much of the sunlight. The air felt cooler and heavier, carrying a damp, earthy scent. The sounds of the forest had also changed. The cheerful chirping of birds had been replaced by a more subdued rustling of leaves and the distant, almost mournful call of an unseen bird. An unsettling silence seemed to hang in the air, amplifying every snap of a twig under our boots. We hiked in a more subdued mood than the day before, the strange rules we had seen casting a pall over our initial enthusiasm. We kept glancing at the sides of the trail, half expecting to see more cryptic signs, but there were none. So, Mark said after about an hour of hiking, his voice a little too loud in the stillness, "What do you make of that sign?" I shrugged, trying to sound nonchalant. "Probably just some eccentric local trying to scare people." "Maybe." He conceded, but his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. But it felt specific. "You know." "Yeah, I agree. Especially the one about the singing. That was just weird." We continued to discuss the rules, trying to come up with logical explanations, but none of them felt entirely satisfactory. The more we talked about it, the more uneasy we became. The trail continued its relentless ascent, and we soon found ourselves breathing heavily. The terrain became even more challenging, with sections of loose scree and rocky outcrops that required careful footing. We had to slow our pace, focusing on each step to avoid a misstep. After what felt like an eternity of uphill climbing, we finally reached a small plateau. We collapsed onto a couple of large, flat rocks, our legs burning and our lungs aching. The view from here was breathtaking. We could see the lower lake far below, shimmering like a sapphire jewel, and the surrounding peaks stretched out in a majestic panorama. "Wow," I gasped, taking in the view. "Worth the climb." Mark nodded in agreement, his face flushed. "Definitely. Canada Pass should be just over that ridge, according to the map." He pointed to a jagged line of peaks in the distance. We rested for a while, eating some energy bars and drinking water. The silence here was even more profound than in the forest below. It felt like we were on top of the world, completely isolated from civilization. As we were getting ready to continue, I noticed something glinting in the sunlight near the edge of the plateau. I walked over to investigate and found a small, metallic object lying on the ground. It was a tarnished silver locket, intricately engraved with a floral pattern. I picked it up and opened it. Inside there were 2 tiny photographs. One was of a young woman with long, dark hair and a sad expression. The other was of a small child, a girl with bright, curious eyes. They looked like they might be mother and daughter. A wave of melancholy washed over me. Who were these people? How had the locket ended up here, so far from any sign of human habitation? Had they been hikers who had lost it? Or was there a more tragic story behind it? "What is it?" Mark asked, coming over to see what I had found. I showed him the locket and the photographs. He examined them with a thoughtful expression. "That's strange," he said. "Looks pretty old. You don't see many people carrying lockets like that these days." We speculated for a while about the locket's origins, but we couldn't come up with any definitive answers. Eventually, I decided to put it in my pocket, figuring I would try to find its owner later, although the chances of that seemed slim. We continued our hike, the discovery of the locket adding another layer of mystery to our already unsettling experience. The trail now led us along a narrow ridge, with steep drops on either side. The wind picked up, whipping around us and carrying the scent of pine and snow. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw something that made us stop dead in our tracks. In the middle of the path, lying on the ground, was a single, brightly colored child's toy, a small, plastic red truck. It looked brand new, as if it had just been dropped there. It seemed completely out of place in this rugged, desolate environment. "What the?" Mark muttered, staring at the toy. "Where did that come from?" We looked around, half expecting to see a child or a family of hikers nearby, but there was no one in sight. The only sounds were the whistling of the wind and the crunching of our boots on the rocky trail. The sight of the toy sent a shiver down my spine. It felt wrong, somehow. Out of place, like a misplaced piece in a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Maybe someone dropped it. I suggested, trying to sound rational, but my voice wavered slightly. Maybe, Mark said, but his eyes were wide with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. But it feels deliberate, doesn't it? We stood there for a moment staring at the toy, a growing sense of unease washing over us. It was as if we were being led down a strange and unsettling path, with cryptic clues scattered along the way. We decided to leave the toy where it was, not wanting to touch it. We carefully stepped around it and continued on our way. The image of the little red truck burned into our minds. The trail began to descend slightly, leading us into a small valley. As we walked, we started to hear a faint sound in the distance. At first, we couldn't quite make it out. It sounded like music. We stopped and listened intently. The sound grew slightly louder, and we realized it was singing. A woman's voice, clear and ethereal, seemed to be carried on the wind. The melody was haunting and beautiful, but there was something about it that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We looked at each other, our faces pale. The fourth rule on the sign flashed into my mind: if you hear singing, run in the opposite direction. That's the singing, I whispered, my voice trembling. Mark's eyes were wide with fear. What do we do? The singing grew louder, closer. It sounded like it was coming from just around the next bend in the trail. Panic surged through me. I didn't know what was causing the singing, but the rule on the sign had been very clear. Run. We have to go, I said, grabbing Mark's arm. Now. We turned and started running back the way we had come, our hearts pounding in our chests. The singing followed us, its haunting melody echoing through the valley. We didn't dare to look back. We just ran as fast as we could, our boots pounding on the rocky trail, our breath coming in ragged gasps. The fear of the unknown propelled us forward, adrenaline coursing through our veins. After what felt like an eternity, the singing finally began to fade in the distance. We slowed to a walk, our legs aching and our lungs burning, but we didn't stop until we had put a good distance between ourselves and the source of the music. We finally collapsed onto a couple of rocks, panting heavily. We looked at each other, our faces pale and our eyes wide with shock. What was that? Mark gasped, his voice hoarse. I shook my head, unable to speak. I had no idea what we had just heard, but it had been terrifying. The beauty of the singing had been overshadowed by an undercurrent of something ancient and malevolent. We sat there for a long time, trying to catch our breath and calm our racing hearts. The silence of the forest seemed to press in on us, heavy and ominous. We need to get out of here, Mark said finally, his voice firm. I don't like this, not one bit. I nodded in agreement. My initial excitement about the hike had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The strange rules, the locket, the toy, and now the singing, it all felt connected, like pieces of a disturbing puzzle. We decided to abandon our plan to reach Canada Pass. Our priority now was to get back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. We turned around and started hiking back the way we had come, our pace quick and determined. The descent was easier on our lungs but harder on our knees. We moved quickly, our eyes scanning the surroundings, constantly on edge. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made us jump. As we retraced our steps, we passed the spot where we had seen the little red truck. It was still lying there in the middle of the trail, its bright color a stark contrast to the muted tones of the forest. It seemed to mock us, a silent reminder of the unsettling events that had transpired. We didn't stop, we just kept walking, our focus solely on getting back to safety. The forest seemed to grow darker and more menacing with each step. The shadows stretched long and distorted, playing tricks on our eyes. We hiked for what felt like hours, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon. The forest grew darker, and the air grew colder. We pulled out our headlamps, their beams cutting through the gloom. Just as we were starting to feel a glimmer of hope, thinking we might actually make it back to the trailhead before nightfall, we saw something that made our blood run cold. Standing in the middle of the trail ahead of us was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its form silhouetted against the fading light. We couldn't make out any details, but there was something about its stillness, its unnatural posture, that sent a wave of pure terror through us. It didn't move. It just stood there, blocking our path. We froze, our headlamps illuminating the figure in their beams. We held our breath, waiting for it to do something, anything. But it remained motionless, a silent, ominous presence in the darkening forest. A primal fear gripped me. I had no idea what this thing was, but every instinct in my body screamed at me to run. What do we do? Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. We were trapped. The singing behind us, the figure in front of us. We were caught in the middle of something terrifying, and I had no idea how we were going to get out. The figure slowly raised one of its arms, pointing a long, skeletal finger towards us, and then it began to sing. The voice was the same one we had heard earlier, but now it was closer, clearer, and infinitely more terrifying. The haunting melody filled the forest, wrapping around us like a cold, suffocating blanket. And as the figure sang, it began to move towards us, its movements slow and deliberate, but somehow impossibly fast. We didn't hesitate. We turned and ran, back the way we had come, the terrifying singing echoing in our ears. The image of the gaunt figure burned into our minds. We ran blindly through the darkening forest, our only thought to escape the nightmare that Canada Pass had become. We plunged back into the darkness, the beam of my headlamp bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Mark was right behind me, his breathing ragged and heavy. The singing pursued us, its eerie melody weaving through the trees, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was like the forest itself was singing, a chorus of something ancient and malevolent. "Faster!" Mark yelled, his voice strained with panic. We pushed ourselves harder, our muscles screaming in protest. The forest was a blur of shadows and indistinct shapes. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept expecting to feel a cold, skeletal hand grab my shoulder, or to see the gaunt figure materialize in front of us again. We didn't dare to speak, our breath too precious to waste on words. We just ran, driven by a primal fear that I had never experienced before. The singing continued, its haunting notes echoing in the darkness, a constant reminder of the thing that was chasing us. After what felt like an eternity, the singing started to fade slightly. We didn't slow down, but a sliver of hope flickered within me. Maybe we were outrunning it. Maybe we were getting away. Just as that thought crossed my mind, I saw a light through the trees ahead. It was a soft, flickering glow, unlike the harsh beam of our headlamps. It seemed to emanate from somewhere off the trail to our left. The third rule on the sign flashed into my mind: if you see a light that is not yours, do not approach it. My instinct was to steer clear, to keep running straight ahead. But Mark, who was slightly ahead of me, suddenly veered off the trail towards the light. "Mark! No!" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness and the pounding of my heart. He didn't hear me, or if he did, he didn't care. He seemed drawn to the light like a moth to a flame. I had no choice but to follow him, fear warring with a sense of desperate loyalty. We pushed our way through a thicket of bushes and stumbled into a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a flickering lantern, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding trees. There was no one else there. "What are you doing?" I hissed at Mark, grabbing his arm. "We're supposed to stay away from other lights." He stared at the lantern, his eyes wide and unfocused. I thought someone was here. I thought they could help us." "Help us?" I exclaimed. "Mark, that thing that was singing, that wasn't human. And that rule was there for a reason." He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the lantern. I could see the fear in his eyes, but there was also a strange sort of fascination. Suddenly, the lantern flickered violently and went out, plunging the clearing into darkness. We were left standing there, our headlamps the only source of light. And then we heard it again. The singing, it was closer now, much closer. "Run," I yelled, grabbing Mark's hand and pulling him back towards the trail. We didn't need any further encouragement. We scrambled back through the bushes and onto the path, our hearts pounding in our chests. The singing was right behind us, the haunting melody filling the air. We ran blindly through the darkness, the sound of our own panic breathing mingling with the eerie song. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw a faint, shadowy figure moving through the trees behind us. It was impossible to make out any details, but I knew it was the thing that had been singing. We stumbled on, our legs burning, our lungs aching. The trail seemed to stretch on endlessly, the darkness pressing in on us from all sides. I felt a surge of despair. Were we ever going to get out of this? Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, we reached a section of the trail that was particularly rocky and uneven. My foot caught on a loose stone, and I stumbled, falling heavily to the ground. "Alex!" Mark cried, stopping and turning back towards me. "Go on," I yelled, pushing myself up onto my hands and knees. "Don't wait for me." "No way," he said, reaching down to help me up. As he pulled me to my feet, I heard a loud crack behind us, followed by a guttural growl. The thing that was chasing us was getting closer. "Me have to go?" I urged, pulling Mark forward. We started running again, my ankle throbbing with pain. I tried to ignore it, focusing all my energy on putting one foot in front of the other. We continued our desperate flight, the singing still echoing behind us. The forest seemed to be closing in, the trees looming like menacing figures in the darkness. Suddenly, we broke out of the dense woods and into a small, open meadow. The moonlight illuminated the scene, casting long, eerie shadows. In the center of the meadow stood a small, dilapidated cabin. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and empty. but there was a faint light flickering in one of the windows, a warm, inviting glow that seemed out of place in this terrifying landscape. The third rule flashed into my mind again: if you see a light that is not yours, do not approach it. But this time, the rule seemed to hold a different kind of weight. It wasn't just a warning, it felt like a desperate plea. Mark stopped, staring at the cabin. "Maybe we can take shelter there," he said, his voice hoarse. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong. The singing was still out there, somewhere in the trees. And that rule, "Mark, I don't think that's a good idea," I said, my voice trembling. "Remember what the sign said." He looked at me, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight. "But what choice do we have? We can't keep running forever." He had a point. We were exhausted, injured, and terrified. The thought of a warm, dry place to rest, even if it was just for a few minutes, was incredibly tempting. "Okay," I said reluctantly, "but we have to be careful." We approached the cabin cautiously, our headlamps illuminating the path ahead. The cabin looked even more dilapidated up close. The wooden walls were weathered and cracked, and the roof sagged in places. The door hung slightly ajar, creaking in the gentle breeze. We hesitated at the doorway, a sense of foreboding washing over me. Something about this place felt deeply wrong. "Hello," Mark called out tentatively. "Is anyone there?" There was no response, only the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the walls. We exchanged a nervous glance and then slowly pushed the door open. The inside of the cabin was small and cluttered. A single lantern sat on a rickety wooden table, casting a dim light on the dusty interior. There was a small fireplace in one corner, but it was cold and empty. The air inside was thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. We stepped inside, our senses on high alert. The silence here was heavy and oppressive, broken only by the creaking of the floorboards under our weight. Suddenly, we heard a noise from the back of the cabin. It sounded like a soft shuffling, followed by a low moan. Mark and I froze, our eyes wide with fear. We slowly turned towards the sound, our headlamps illuminating a dark doorway leading to another room. "Hello," Mark called out again, his voice barely above a whisper. There was no response, only the shuffling and the moaning. Against my better judgment, I started to move towards the doorway, my headlamp beam cutting through the darkness. Mark followed close behind. We stepped into the other room and stopped dead in our tracks. Lying on a small cot in the corner was an old woman. Her face was pale and gaunt, and her eyes were closed. She was moaning softly, her body twitching slightly under a thin, tattered blanket. Relief washed over me. It was just an old woman. Maybe she was injured or sick. "Mom," Mark said, gently approaching the cot. "Are you all right?" The old woman didn't respond. Her moaning continued, and her body twitched again. Mark reached out to touch her hand, and that's when I saw it. Her skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and her fingernails, they were long and black and sharp, like claws. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just an old woman. This was something else. Something wrong.
"Mark, get back!"
I yelled, grabbing his arm and pulling him away from the cot. Just as I did, the old woman's eyes snapped open. They were black and empty, filled with an ancient, malevolent light. A guttural growl escaped her lips, and she lunged at us with surprising speed. We stumbled back, our hearts pounding in our chests. The old woman scrambled off the cot, her movements unnatural and jerky. She moved with a speed that belied her frail appearance. We backed towards the doorway, our eyes fixed on the terrifying figure. The singing had stopped. The only sound now was the low growling of the creature in front of us.
"We have to get out of here!"
I yelled, pushing Mark towards the door. We scrambled out of the cabin and back into the night, not stopping until we were a good distance away. We didn't look back. We just ran. The image of the old woman's black eyes burned into our minds. We were back on the trail now, running blindly through the darkness. The singing had started again, faint at first, but growing louder with each step. It felt like we were being herded, driven towards some unknown and terrifying fate. We ran for what felt like hours, our bodies pushed to their absolute limit. The forest seemed to mock us, its shadows twisting into grotesque shapes. The singing grew louder and louder, until it felt like it was inside our heads, a chorus of voices whispering unspeakable things. Suddenly, we heard a different sound aloud, crashing noise coming from the woods to our right. It sounded like something large was moving through the underbrush, breaking branches and trampling over anything in its path. We froze, our headlamps illuminating the darkness. We could see the trees shaking and hear the heavy footfalls getting closer. Whatever it was big, and it was coming straight for us. We didn't know what to do. We were trapped between the singing thing behind us and this new, unseen threat in the woods. And then I remembered the second rule on the sign: do not make loud noises after nightfall. We had been yelling, crashing through the underbrush, making all sorts of noise in our panicked flight. Had we attracted something else, something even worse than the singing figure and the creature in the cabin? The crashing in the woods grew louder, closer. We could see a pair of glowing eyes through the trees, large and menacing. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. We were out of options. We were surrounded. And then the singing stopped. The forest fell silent, the only sound the heavy breathing of Mark and me, and the crashing in the woods getting closer and closer. The glowing eyes emerged from the trees, and I finally saw what was coming for us. It was huge, its form vaguely canine but twisted and monstrous. Its teeth were long and sharp, and its eyes glowed with an unholy light. It let out a deafening roar, and then it lunged. I closed my eyes, bracing for the impact. This was it. This was how it was going to end. In the darkness, in the middle of nowhere, hunted by something unspeakable. But the impact never came. Instead, I heard a sickening thud and a high-pitched screech. I cautiously opened my eyes and saw the monstrous creature lying on the ground, its body twitching. Standing over it was the gaunt figure that had been singing, its long, skeletal hand dripping with a dark, viscous fluid. The figure turned its attention to us, its black eyes piercing through the darkness. It didn't sing this time. It simply stared at us, its expression unreadable. Then it turned and walked away, disappearing silently into the trees. Mark and I stood there, frozen in shock, staring at the dead creature. We didn't know what had just happened. Had the singing figure saved us? Or was this just a different kind of nightmare? The silence of the forest was broken only by our ragged breathing. We looked at each other, our faces pale and our eyes wide with terror and confusion. We had survived, for now, but I had a feeling our ordeal was far from over. We were still deep in the wilderness, and the strange rules of Canada Pass were still hanging over our heads. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that we had broken more than one of them. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the lifeless form of the monstrous creature. The silence of the forest was thick and heavy, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. The events of the last few hours had pushed us to the brink, and our minds were struggling to process the bizarre turn of events. What just happened? Mark finally stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I shook my head, still too stunned to speak. The gaunt, singing figure had seemed so menacing, so intent on chasing us. Why would it suddenly turn and protect us? It made no sense. I don't know, I managed to say, my voice trembling, but I'm not sticking around to find out. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, replaced by a bone, deep exhaustion, and an annoying sense of dread. We needed to get out of these woods, and we needed to do it now. We didn't waste any more time. We turned and started walking back down the trail, our pace quick and determined. The image of the dead creature and the mysterious figure lingered in my mind, fueling our desperate flight. The singing had stopped, and the forest remained eerily silent. The only sounds were the crunching of our boots on the path and our own heavy breathing. Every shadow seemed to hold a potential threat. Every rustle of leaves made us jump. As we continued our descent, the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky. A faint grey light filtered through the trees, gradually illuminating the path ahead. The forest still looked menacing in the dim light, but the growing visibility offered a small measure of comfort. We passed the dilapidated cabin, where we had encountered the terrifying old woman. It stood silent and still in the early morning light, looking even more sinister than it had in the darkness. We didn't dare to go near it, giving it a wide berth as we hurried past. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the gaunt figure or something else lurking in the trees. But there was nothing. We reached the small meadow where we had first seen the cabin. The little red toy truck was still lying in the middle of the path, its bright color a stark reminder of the unsettling events that had unfolded. We stepped around it, not wanting to touch it. The trail began to widen and become less rugged as we continued our descent. We recognized some of the landmarks from our hike in, and a flicker of hope ignited within me. We were getting closer to the trailhead. As the sky grew brighter, the sounds of the forest began to change again. The mournful calls of unseen birds were replaced by the more familiar chirping of smaller birds. The air felt a little lighter, the oppressive silence slowly giving way to the sounds of nature. We were still on edge, but with each step, our confidence grew. We had survived the night. We had faced something terrifying and somehow made it through. Just as we thought we were in the clear, we reached a section of the trail that ran alongside a steep ravine. The path was narrow and treacherous, with loose rocks and crumbling edges. We had to walk carefully, watching our footing. Suddenly, we heard a sound from below. It was a faint, rhythmic humming, carried on the gentle morning breeze. It sounded almost like singing. My blood ran cold. Not again. We stopped and listened intently. The humming grew slightly louder, and we realized it was coming from the bottom of the ravine. It was a low, melodic sound, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. The fourth rule flashed into my mind. If you hear singing, run in the opposite direction. But this wasn't the same eerie, haunting singing we had heard before. This was different. Softer, almost alluring. Mark looked at me, his face etched with apprehension. What do we do? I hesitated. We were so close to the trailhead. Turning back now felt almost unbearable. But the rules, they had proven to be more than just a joke. I don't know, I said, my voice barely a whisper. But that humming, it doesn't feel right. As if in response, the humming grew louder, and a faint light flickered through the trees at the bottom of the ravine. It was a soft, warm glow, almost inviting. The third rule echoed in my mind. If you see a light that is not yours, do not approach it. We were trapped. The humming and the light were coming from the ravine to our left, and the trail ahead was the only way out. We have to keep going, Mark said, his voice firm. We're almost there. We can't let whatever that is stop us now. I knew he was right. We had come too far to turn back. We just had to be careful. We continued along the narrow path, our eyes fixed on the trail ahead, trying to ignore the humming and the light below. But it was hard. The sound seemed to seep into our minds, trying to draw us in. As we rounded a bend in the trail, we saw something that made us stop dead in our tracks. Standing in the middle of the path ahead of us was the gaunt figure. It was the same one that had chased us, the same one that had saved us from the monstrous creature. It stood motionless, blocking our way, its black eyes fixed on us. This time, it wasn't singing. It simply stood there, its presence radiating an aura of ancient power and unsettling stillness. Fear gripped me, cold and paralyzing. We were trapped. There was no way around it. The figure slowly raised one of its long, skeletal fingers and pointed towards the ravine. The humming from below grew louder, more insistent. The light flickered brighter. It was clear what it wanted us to do. It was leading us towards the humming and the light. But why? Was it trying to lure us into a trap? Or was it trying to show us something? We looked at each other, our faces pale with fear and uncertainty. We didn't know what to do. The figure remained motionless, its fingers still pointing towards the ravine. The humming continued, its melodic sound both alluring and terrifying. Finally, Mark took a tentative step forward. We have to trust it, he whispered. It saved us before. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. But Mark was right. What other choice did we have? Slowly, cautiously, we started to move towards the figure. It didn't move, just kept its finger pointed towards the ravine. As we got closer, we could see a faint path leading down the steep slope. The humming was almost deafening now, and the light below was a warm, inviting glow. The gaunt figure stepped aside, allowing us to pass. It didn't follow us, just stood there at the edge of the ravine, watching us. With a shared sense of trepidation, Mark and I started down the path. It was steep and slippery, and we had to hold onto roots and rocks to keep from falling. As we descended, the humming grew louder, and the light became brighter. We finally reached the bottom of the ravine and found ourselves in a small, hidden clearing. In the center of the clearing was a small, crystal clear pool of water. The light emanated from the pool itself, a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to come from within. And surrounding the pool were several figures. They were human-like in shape, but their skin was pale and translucent, and their eyes glowed with the same soft light as the pool. They were the ones humming, their voices blending together in a beautiful, hypnotic melody. They turned to look at us as we entered the clearing, their glowing eyes filled with a gentle curiosity. They didn't seem menacing, just otherworldly. We stood there for a moment, stunned by the sight. This was what the rules had been warning us about. These strange, luminous beings. One of the figures stepped forward, its movements graceful and fluid. It raised a hand towards us, and the humming softened slightly. It spoke, its voice a melodic whisper that seemed to resonate in our minds rather than our ears. "Welcome," it said. "You have followed the rules." Mark and I exchanged a bewildered glance. We had followed some of the rules, yes, but we had also broken others. We had made loud noises, we had approached a light that wasn't ours, and we had run from the singing. Where we heard singing. Mark stammered, pointing back towards the trail, and we ran. The luminous figure tilted its head slightly. That was not our song. That was the Guardian. It tests those who enter our domain. "Guardian?" I asked. The gaunt figure? The figure nodded. "It ensures that only those who respect the balance of this place may find us. And the rules?" Mark asked. "What happens if you break them?" The figure's gentle expression didn't change, but its voice held a hint of sadness. Those who do not respect the balance, they become part of it. A chill ran down my spine. I thought of the old woman in the cabin, her unnatural movements, her black eyes. Had she broken the rules? Was that her fate? The luminous figure turned its gaze to me. "You found something that was lost," it said, its eyes focusing on my pocket. I instinctively reached into my pocket and pulled out the silver locket I had found earlier. The figure nodded. "It belongs with us. It holds the memories of one who strayed from the path." I handed the locket to the figure, a sense of peace washing over me as I did. It felt right that it should be here with these strange, gentle beings. The figure smiled, a soft, radiant glow emanating from its face. "You may leave now," it said. "You have shown respect. The path ahead is clear." We nodded, a sense of gratitude and relief washing over us. We turned and started back up the path towards the trail, the humming of the luminous figures fading behind us. When we reached the top of the ravine, the gaunt figure was gone. The trail ahead was clear, just as the luminous being had promised. We walked quickly, our pace fueled by a renewed sense of urgency. The sun was fully up now, and the forest looked less menacing in the bright morning light. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we saw the familiar wooden sign marking the trailhead. Canada Pass Trail. We practically ran the last few steps, collapsing onto the gravel parking lot, our bodies aching, our minds still reeling from the events of the past night. We looked back at the trail, the entrance to the woods looking deceptively peaceful in the morning light. We knew the truth, though. We knew what lurked within those trees, the strange rules and the even stranger beings that enforced them. We got into the car, our bodies trembling with exhaustion and lingering fear. As Mark started the engine, I glanced back at the sign one last time. Canada Pass. A place of breathtaking beauty, but also a place of ancient rules and unimaginable terrors. We had gone there seeking adventure, but we had found something much more profound, something that would forever change the way we looked at the wilderness. As we drove away, leaving the mountains behind us, I knew one thing for sure: I would never hike to Canada Pass again. Some places are best left undisturbed, their secrets kept hidden among the trees. And the strange rules of Canada Pass were a secret I had no desire to uncover any further.